back, daylight savings, right? Yeah. So fall back tonight so that we don't miss things tomorrow. Get them off. Yeah. So I got this laser pointer thing. I feel like I'm in high school again. I'm going to start sticking it in girls' eyes or something, get in trouble. Okay, so I am, as we said earlier, Jay Dyer. I run the site. Thank you. There's one. It's always nice to have one fan, right? I'm introducing myself as the backup second string host. So I run the site jaysanalysis.com, which deals with film, philosophy, geopolitics, and the esoteric. And what we're going to be talking about today is Hollywood, predictive programming, and the secret space program / breakaway civilization. My background is in philosophy. I did philosophy and history as undergrad. My graduate work was philosophy and literature. So
ja, wir müssen noch mal kurz hier. Irgendwie zickt das in letzter Zeit immer rum mit dem Untertitel. Vielleicht sollte ich meinen PC irgendwann mal nach einem Jahr neu starten. Das wäre aber zu einfach. Das muss er wegstecken, die kleine Pussy. So, während ich auf mein Essen warte, gucken wir jetzt weiter das an.
I suffer through one more. I promise it'll be fun. Well, I can't promise that, but I'll try. Site jaysanalysis.com, which deals with film, philosophy, geopolitics, and the esoteric. And what we're going to be talking about today is Hollywood, predictive programming, and the secret space program / breakaway civilization. My background is in philosophy. I did philosophy and history as undergrad. My graduate work was philosophy and literature. So I decided that it would be fun. It's kind of a trend in academia now to choose sort of pop culture topics if you do liberal arts. So as a liberal arts major, I chose to do Ian Fleming and James Bond. Now, the somewhat Marxist establishment at my university, you could imagine how happy they were when I chose to do James Bond as a thesis topic. We actually butted heads quite a bit, right? But I think that what we're going to see is that there's so many things in Ian Fleming and in Bond that will reveal, it's going to shed so much light on the topics that we've heard today that I think you're genuinely going to be blown away. Now, I am a Bond fan. I grew up watching Bond. But to learn more about Ian Fleming himself and what he did in naval psyops was, I think, yet another level of revelation beyond what you've seen in the films. And then going through the novels, I saw, again, so much more because, as we're going to see, so many of his works were actually based on real-world covert operations that were run by British intelligence and British naval intelligence. So, but what we're going to start with is this idea of predictive programming or gaslighting. What is predictive programming? Why do you say that? Well, this is, I believe, a sort of a deep psyop technique where we utilize the concept of twilight language. And this is foreshadowing in fictional film to prepare the way for, to use H.G. Wells's terms, the things to come. Predictive programming has the effect of conditioning the mass mind through the manipulation of archetypes. And I think Fleming will be an exemplar of the crossover between the intelligence agencies and the collaboration with Hollywood. Now, most people who research this topic will know about the idea of the Pentagon or different military agencies having a liaison office with Hollywood, right? So if a film director wants to utilize tanks or an aircraft carrier or something like that, then he gets the okay from the liaison office. It actually goes far deeper than that. I believe that from my research, it's from the very beginning of Hollywood that we see a tie-in to the intelligence agencies. And so we can go back to even people like Julia Child who worked for MI5, or we can actually go all the way back to the period of the Elizabethan era with John Dee, right, who was Elizabeth's court magus, who was actually her spy as well. So this is a long-standing tradition in British intelligence, and you could see why there would be a tie-in between theater and intelligence work, because you're playing a role, you're acting, right? And that's what we see coming through in so many of Fleming's novels that we're going to get to. So I've got a couple examples here of, so you say, well, use Twilight language. What is that? Well, I think that this is actually a concept that, if you've read Michael Hoffman's Secret Society of Psychological Warfare, then you know that he speaks of this concept of, from the Vedic text, what's called Sandabhayasa. And this is the notion that events can actually be written like a script. So you can have certain phenomena, certain events that happen, that if you believe in higher entities, angelic forces, demonic forces, whatever, then, or God, then the notion would be that it's these higher level forces that are actually able to utilize events and that use numerology, symbology, and so forth to actually speak a language on a higher level than just, say, a written text, right? So one of the topics that I studied in grad school was semiotics. Semiotics is the philosophical discipline of studying signs and symbols. It's the philosophy of signs and symbols. Now, one of the most famous semioticians of our day is an Italian writer named Umberto Eco. So if you've ever read The Name of the Rose or Foucault's Pendulum, the famous novels, those are both by Eco. Now, Eco is important because he actually wrote a famous essay in the 60s called Narrative Structure in Ian Fleming. And what he did there was he actually raised Ian Fleming's fictional literature out of the status of pulp fiction and gave it a little more academic credence. He gave him some academic acumen that he did not previously have. So I think that Eco's place as a bondologist is interesting, because so he's not just a writer, he's also, there's this whole field of bondology where you study Ian Fleming and Bond and so forth. And what Eco says is that there's a famous lecture he gave where he says that, you know, fiction is, we think of it as unreal. But in a way, a fictional world is kind of real, right? Because it's at least real in our psyche, right? And when we take fiction, or when a writer takes fiction, or a film director or whatever, and then puts it into reality, it's then become a part of reality, right? And then it can, in return, affect a mass population, the mass mind, mass consciousness, or whatever. And that playing with this, right, is the manipulation of archetypes. And that's how we can be conditioned, and also break our conditioning, through this synthetic Hollywood overlay that I think is part of the psychological warfare. So when we understand these things, we can recognize it, and that's kind of what my lecture is going to do here. So this is a classic example. This is from the 1999 film The Matrix, and this is Neo's passport. Now, if we look at Neo's passport expiration date, it expires on 9/11/2001. The Matrix came out in 1999. So I'm just using this as one example amongst hundreds of predictive programming that clearly seems to evidence some kind of real-world fulfillment that I think is beyond mere coincidence, right? If we want to understand some of this arcane language I used above, up here, a good way to understand it is kind of gaslighting, right? So in psychology, this is the notion of, if you've ever seen this classic film with Ingrid Bergman, directed by Kukor, then you'll know that what happens is there is she's an heiress, more or less. She has a bunch of money, and so this guy comes along who's her sort of white knight savior, right? And he offers to deliver her out of her loneliness and so forth. And what he does is he goes through this elaborate process of running this little mini psyops where he actually tricks her into thinking that she doesn't even know what reality is, right? And he's, by the abuser installing into the abusee the notion of not being able to determine reality, the abuser then, in a sort of narcissistic sense, a psychopathic sense, is able to instill into the person a new reality that they control, right? So that's the psychological warfare aspect of this. And it's brilliantly displayed in that film. Some have called it an Alfred Hitchcock film that Hitchcock did not do. So as we move to Fleming, Ian Fleming famously said, "Everything I write has precedent in truth," right? Now, this is not the actual MI5 logo. It's the old MI5 logo, and then somebody stuck a 007 on there, which I thought was kind of appropriate, right? But Fleming was not in MI5. He was, of course, naval psyops. But I just thought, well, this is like a pyramid with an all-seeing eye. We've got to put that up there, right? It's got to be there, right? So Fleming is interesting because he comes from a prominent banking family. Fleming's grandfather was actually involved in the establishment of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And if you know about that, you know that's what would become BP, right? Which ties directly into Operation Ajax and the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953 and the installation of the Shah, which was done by British intelligence and the CIA, now famously declassified. Again, Fleming's father was a prominent banker, BFF, with Winston Churchill and J.P. Morgan, who we heard mentioned earlier today. Now, what most people don't know about Ian Fleming is that he was not just a typical naval officer. In fact, it's only been in the last few years that a number of books have been released, written, that really delve into his past, and it's kind of, I guess, I don't know if it's like past the era of the Official Secrets Act in the UK or whatever, but now there's all these books out that talk about the fact that most of the rumors and speculation were actually true. One of these is Ian Fleming's Secret War by Craig Cobble. Fleming was no low-level officer, but was in fact a highly placed naval psyops operative who led covert missions and devised numerous wartime deception, such as participation in Operation Mincemeat. And this is a funny one because this is an elaborate disinformation operation where Allied powers used a dead German soldier to lead German high command down a false lead. And so what they did was they took this dead body and stuck it out there, and they stuck fake papers in his breast. So when the Germans came and found him, they were completely wrong about, I believe it was an invasion. They were off on where a certain invasion would happen. So what you can start to see is that these kind of operations that Fleming's involved in, you start thinking, if you've watched any 007 movies, or if you've seen any, read in the novels, then you'll know that these kind of things start popping up in the fiction, right? So this is going to get to Seeker Space Program, I promise. I'm going somewhere. We got to jump around, so we're going through loops and tunnels here. So where might some of these characters come from? Well, there is an interesting book written by Anthony Masters, The Man Who Was M, The Life of Maxwell Knight. Now, Maxwell Knight is in the novels and stories, of course, Bond's handler. It's not Judi Dench, ultimately, in the books. Knight was an MI6 spy master and a ritual magician who ran covert operations against Marxist groups by playing the role of a radical leftist, and they would infiltrate the Marxists. Anthony Masters' biography discusses Knight's interest in Crowley and magic. Most are aware of the connection, of course, as we said, of 007 from John Dee, but of course Bond is also an amalgamation, not just of John Dee, but also from Fleming's life himself. Another interesting character, Knight, right, approves of the plan to use Crowley via Wheatley. Who's Dennis Wheatley? Dennis Wheatley was a fellow British spy and esoteric fiction writer who introduces Knight to the plan to use Crowley, which Fleming was in part involved in hatching, right, to ultimately lure Rudolf Hess to parachute into Scotland. Now, this is somewhat debated, I realize that, right? So whether or not this was really how it went down, I don't know, but I think it's very interesting. And you're right, there's actually a story on Her Majesty's Secret Service where Bond hatches the plan to lure Blofeld into an MI6 trap through false information, right? So a lot of people believe that Blofeld was in part based on Crowley. Now, the true nature, as I said, of that tale is uncertain, but Wheatley actually wrote quite a few novels on the occult and was interested in everything esoteric, basically. Anything you could think of, he was into it. And it's actually Wheatley's character series, the Gregory Salas novels, that are also an inspiration for 007. I know this is old hat, probably all know this, but it's worth mentioning here, right? So when we think about the fact that it's very, very likely, according to Ben McIntyre in his book on Fleming, I think it's On Her Majesty's Secret Service, no, it's, the name escapes me at the moment, but McIntyre's book on Fleming discusses the connection between MI5 as using Crowley as an asset for a period of time at least, right? So we know that much is true. Whether or not the Hess aspect is true, we don't know. Now, as many are aware, Hubbard was an intimate of Crowley for a period, which led to a love tryst between Jack Parsons' wife. Jack Parsons would, of course, be the Crowleyan who would go on to found the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. This is sort of the nascent beginning era of NASA and the rocket program. So spies and rockets collide, as we see Crowley was for a time an asset of British intelligence. As I mentioned, Crowley is believed to be an inspiration for not just Blofeld, but also Le Chiffre, who is the first villain in Casino Royale, beginning with Smersh, who will later become Spectre. 007 and Operation Paperclip. We've heard of Operation Paperclip today, so I won't rehearse a lot of that. I know everyone here is familiar with it. The 1955 Fleming novel, Moonraker, centers on a German V-2 rocket program and a nascent secret space program through Paperclip. Graf Hugo von der Drache, Sir Hugo Drax, operates a private space program under shells and front corporations by which he obtains atomic secrets from the Soviet Smersh to ICBM blast London with his Moonraker, from which he will actually game the system and reap tremendous profits due to false flag terror. So fear the bomb almighty. Does this sound familiar? Like false flag terror, attacking it, put options, 9/11 maybe? A little bit more on Fleming to give us an idea of where some of these stories come from. During World War II, Fleming's naval psyops machinations conceived of a special ops team that would conduct black ops against the Germans, including the eventual capture of an Enigma machine. If you saw the recent film with Benedict Cumberbatch about Alan Turing, that's the Enigma machine. And Nazi secrets. Operation GoldenEye would monitor Spain for a possible Franco alliance with Axis powers. Now here's a juicy one that I bet a lot of people don't know. If you read Andrew Lycett's classic mainstream text on the life of Ian Fleming, you'll learn that Fleming and other members of the Secret Intelligence Service of the UK would actually help Bill Donovan set up the first fledgling American Secret Service known as the OSS. This is 1947, right? The shadow government is looking more and more like Spectre. On Her Majesty's Spectral Service. Now, why would I title it that? Well, this 1969 film, version of the 1964-5 Fleming novel, is actually very faithful to the story, where we're going to see that the later versions of the film versions and incarnations will depart quite a bit, but there's a reason for that. This film adds a curious line where Telly Savalas is playing Blofeld, and he says, "I will, Mr. Bond, attack London through vaccines." This is actually in the screenplay, right? That's not mentioned in the novel, right? So what we're going to start seeing is this pattern of extra revelations placed into the film versions that aren't in the novels. Spectre is thus once again concerned with biowarfare, genetic modification, and depopulation. The attack is planned under the cover of a private allergy clinic that brainwashes babes, Bond girls, to carry out the attack, right? Now, there's also a hint of brainwashing and mind control here, right? Because this allergy clinic that Blofeld is running is under that's the auspices, right? The front that it's using. What he's actually doing is bringing in these sort of quasi-pop star models and brainwashing them. He's going to send them back to London, and they're going to attack London's food supply in the novel. And then, as Telly Savalas says, also through vaccines. Does this sound familiar, right? I mean, Mike Adams is here, right? He writes, there's a million articles at the National News about the problems with vaccines, right? And all the dangers of vaccines. I think probably a lot of people here know that. So here you have in 1969, who in 1969 would have thought to question vaccines? I mean, come on, right? This is right after Jonas Salk. I mean, come on. This is insane in my view. Now, as we move on, the 1971.
Ich muss immer wieder meinen Klickfinger loben für die Auswahl nach dem absoluten Chaos-Prinzip meiner Sendung. Ja, eigentlich hatte ich heute Winnetou im Kopf und wollte irgendwas über Old Shatterhand und Winnetou und Karl May machen. Und da dachte ich mir, na, das ist vielleicht ein bisschen Schnarch. Machen wir da erstmal vielleicht mal, was machen wir? Und dann sind wir auf das gestoßen. Aber es ist faszinierend. Also jetzt nicht für Frauen, die haben James Bond-Filme wahrscheinlich nie gesehen. Aber wer die James Bond-Filme kennt und jetzt mal die James Bond-Filme so hört, wie er sie erzählt, wo ist der Unterschied von Klaus Schwab zu Blomfeld? Ich sehe da keinen. Die haben sogar dieselbe Frisur. Die haben dieselben Klamotten. Klaus Schwab ist Blomfeld. Oder Hugo Drax. Ja, die Merkel ist ja die Tochter von Hugo Drax. Warum ist das bei Ian Fleming ein Deutscher? Woher hat er das gewusst? Ach ja, naja. Ja, deutsche Untertitel geht nicht, sonst hätte ich es ja gemacht. Oh, dass ihr euch das nicht denken weg ist. Problem, das ist das, ich weiß nicht, worum es da Titel habt, kriegt ihr lieber einen englischen. Ich weiß, die Logik ist total bescheuert. Aber ich habe Hunger, ich warte auf mein Essen. Von daher, wenn Frauen unlogisch sein dürfen, darf ich das auch. Weiter geht's.
Diamonds Are Forever. This is juicy. The 1956 novel highlights diamond smuggling networks, but the film incarnation centers around a private space program operating under various fronts involving Willard White, who is a stand-in explicitly for Howard Hughes. Into aerospace. And in fact, he directed one of the most expensive movies of that prior to the aerospace period called Hell's Angels. Hell's Angels was a war propaganda film. Now, I forget the name of the actor, but it's the guy who plays Jimmy Dean in the old Jimmy Dean sausage commercials. He's actually the guy that's playing Willard White here, who is explicitly a stand-in for Howard Hughes. In both reality and in the fictional incarnation, it's the film. It's White running casino mafia markets for his money laundering and black budget funding. But there's a kidnapping that happens by So this film is actually the first film in history to discuss the space through satellite warfare. And what's also neat is that this is going to parallel the film incarnation, which will be one of our most important points in this talk. 1974, The Man with the Golden Tongue. Now, this is a 2015 Air Force lab-directed energy weapon. This is Christopher Lee playing Scaramanga, talking to her. And if you remember this film, it looks like that. He fires this big directed energy weapon, right? Also interesting is that it utilizes solar power, right? This is set during the 1973 energy crisis, and according to writer F. William Engdahl, it was actually Bilderberg that engineered this crisis through OPEC. It wasn't just OPEC. It was Kissinger and Bilderberg that managed what happened with OPEC. So what does Scaramanga do? Well, he threatens the West through offering his privatized solar weapon technology highest bidder. There's not really a point to this one. I just wanted to throw this in. Right? So you can't have a talk about 007 without some Bond girls in the mix. Feminists, if you want to throw tomatoes at me, go ahead. It's fine. By the way, I don't know why I just think it's interesting that so you have, I forget yeah, right. But so he's playing the same kind of role that he does in Fantasy Island with Christopher Lee. That's interesting. 1979, Moonraker. This is a big one. Now, we saw in the novel version of Moonraker, that was about the V2 rocket program.
Überlegt euch mal, Moonraker war 1979 Science Fiction. Heute wissen wir, dass Moonraker damals das war abgeschrieben. Das war keine Science Fiction mehr, das war schon real. Die waren damals schon so weit. Also könnt ihr das umrechnen, was die heute Science Fiction nennen, das gibt's doch auch schon. Deswegen gucke ich gerne die neuen Transformers-Filme, wenn dort die Bösewichte hier den Minitronen aussenden, das gibt's da alles schon. Das ist da alles. Du denkst dann nur, ja, das ist alles am Greenscreen. Nee, die Dinger sind real. Du musst unterscheiden zwischen PC und das ist real. Und die vermixen das ja so genial. Die meisten glauben mir auch, es gibt Corona. Ja, Corona wird am Ende als böser Traum in die Geschichte eingehen. Es war ein böser Traum, zum alle aufgewacht, alles cool. Ja, aber es ist faszinierend. Wie James Bond. Gut, das interessiert die Frauen weniger. Aber es ist nie unser Problem. Ja, James Bond jetzt schon. Wenn man die Filme kennt, gut, viele sind grottenschlecht gespielt. Also Roger Moore, das kannst du gar nicht bringen. Wenn du schon einen Schwulen nimmst, dann soll er jetzt die Frau richtig küssen und die so. Naja. Aber in jedem James Bond-Film hat James Bond eine Frau vergewaltigt. Um Geheimnisse mit seinem Penis dort rauszupressen. Aus der bösen Lass Miranda eine nette halbe Stunde.
And it was about paperclip, right? Phase 1, I call it, of the secret space program. Moonraker, the film, will actually be phase 2 of the secret space program. And it will be a pretty smooth, I believe, continuation. So the second phase of the secret space program and the breakaway civilization is explicitly revealed in this film in one of the most clear ways I could think of. The Reich-style plan of a genetically modified utopia where an Earth cleansed through a kind of Skynet chemtrail biowarfare attack prepares the way for a new Genesis. We think of Dr. Farrell's previous talk on the buildup of the satellite spy networks at last year's space conference. This, again, mirrors the plot of Diamonds Are Forever, except that now it extends into space. Now, another interesting point in this is that when Roger Moore as Bond is heading towards Moonraker, which in this is actually a space station, he has an interesting line where he says, oh, it's actually Noah's Ark, and 2 by 2 they entered the Ark. And he calls it Project Noah. Now that's going to be useful because that pattern will repeat in the rest of my lecture.
Das müssten wir auch mal gucken. Ob die wirklich ein Projekt Noah. Schon weil der Name halt schon biblisch klingt, die werden garantiert irgendwas gemacht haben. Die sind doch so, die haben doch alle einen kurzen Penis. Ja, und neben Erdöl ist Penisneid immer noch das größte Problem auf dem Planeten. Daraus entsteht dann so ein, das ist halt Penisneid. So, kommt mein Essen jetzt hier bald mal, ich habe Hunger.
And what does Drax do in the film version? Drax is a fascist, and he builds
diese sinnlosen Diskussionen über kommt der Finanzcrash oder nicht. Ja, er kommt. Und sie müssen alle heulen im Fernsehen. Es läuft ab wie 2008, nur dass diesmal ein paar Leute verhaftet werden. Ihr werdet alle am Fernseher sitzen, ihr werdet sagen, oh mein Gott, warum heulen die alle im Fernsehen? Anders kriegst du das Schaf nicht aus dem Wirtschaftswunder raus. Der Crash muss kommen. Er wird nur nichts kaputt machen. Er wird nur dafür sorgen, dass Leute im Fernsehen heulen. Die Wirtschaftsexperten, die ein Leben lang ausgebildet wurden für den Bullshit, die dann nichts mehr erklären können. Das wird noch sehr lustig. Die werden alle heulen im Fernsehen, weil sie es nicht mehr verstehen, ihr eigenes Finanzsystem. Da werden wir mit Popcorn da sitzen, weil das Neue läuft schon längst parallel. Während man das Alte jetzt in Realtime explodieren lässt. Ist das so schwer? Na. Sonst wollen die doch nie raus aus ihrem Wirtschaftswunder. Es muss crashen. Und zwar so, dass die gesamte Menschheit sagt, nie wieder so ins System. Aber es darf keinen Kollateralschaden geben. Das ist alles schon inbegriffen im Plan. Also von daher, chillax. Ja? Aber sonst wollen die nie, die glauben doch wirklich, dass die in einem Wirtschaftswunder leben. Die glauben doch wirklich an Demokratie. Ich kann das Wort schon gar nicht mehr sagen, ohne zu lachen. Demokratie. Ja, sag mal 10-mal hintereinander Demokratie, ohne zu lachen. Dann bist du noch scharf. Dann hat es keinen Sinn. Wenn du aber Demokratie bloß noch, das machen wir, glaube ich, als neuen Standard. Wenn du Demokratie nicht mehr aussprechen kannst, ohne zu lachen, dann bist du auf jeden Fall erwacht. Egal. Ich warte weiter auf mein Essen. Früher hatte ich mir eine App erfunden, hier 3-mal klatschen, dann müsste mir eigentlich mal was zu essen bringen, aber die funktioniert irgendwie nicht so richtig. Muss ich glaube noch so ein Adapterstück namens Frau dazu kaufen. Ach ja.
An underground base in Argentina. And we heard Argentina mentioned earlier today, didn't we? Yes, we did. And he builds it on top of an old temple. Now, what happened at this site? Drax explains that there was a certain orchid that grew locally, and this orchid gave off some sort of off gas or something that ultimately resulted in the sterilization of the entire population of that civilization.
Es gab doch auch einen James-Bond-Film, da wollten die Fort Knox mit der Atombombe angreifen, um somit das Gold zu verstrahlen und den Goldpreis für den, der das letzte Gold hat, in die Höhe zu bringen. Und da fällt mir gerade ein, die haben doch in Nagasaki und in Hiroshima das gesamte geklaute Gold gelagert, was die Japaner aus ganz Asien geklaut haben und eingeschmolzen haben. Und wenn dort quasi jetzt eine Bombe drauf fällt, dann ist das ja offiziell wertlos, das Gold. Und dann hat ja derjenige, nennen wir ihn jetzt einfach Adolf Hitlers beste Buddies, die jetzt hier quasi das restliche Gold aus Europa nach Amerika transferiert hatten, plötzlich das Monopol aufs Gold. Weil ja die Atombombe aufs restliche Gold geflogen ist in Nagasaki. Aber gibt es nie einen James-Bond-Film, der das genau andersrum erzählt? Ich finde das gerade sehr lustig. Ich muss öfters James Bond gucken.
Drax says, Mr. Bond, I will go one further. He says, I'm not just going to sterilize the population. No, no. I'm actually going to depopulate the earth. How is he going to do it? He's going to do it through aerial spraying. This is what Drax says in the film. So he extracts from the orchid, black orchid, this bioweapon that he's going to shoot from Moonraker space station into Earth's atmosphere, which is ultimately kind of nerd gas, ultimately. And what's he going to do? He's going to repopulate the Earth, reseed the Earth with his progeny. And so it's kind of like Drax and 50 good-looking women. Not a bad plan, actually. I'm kidding. I'm joking. Drax intends to nerve gas the globe through chemtrails. And again, keep in mind that it's Project Noah that's mentioned explicitly. Now, I apologize, we are going to have to hop around a little bit, so.
Wie dumm muss man sein, Alter? Ich habe mir eine Pizza bestellt und ein Bier. Und das ist in meiner Welt eine Pizza und ein Bier. Und da guckt man auf die Uhr, wie spät haben wir es denn? Mensch, es ist vielleicht die Uhrzeit. Gut, das ist während meiner Diät, das ist nicht ganz praktisch. Na ja, ich weiß, okay, das ist während meiner Diät. Aber egal, ich habe Bock auf eine Pizza und ein Bier. Und die hätten schon längst da sein müssen. Was da Leute wieder reininterpretieren. Du könntest gleich aufstehen und dir einen Teller in die Fresse klatschen, einfach nur weil du strunzdumm bist. Komm mal aus deiner Welt in die Normalität. Um die Uhrzeit essen normale Menschen. Naja, eigentlich eine Stunde eher, aber es dauert halt heute hier irgendwie. Ne?
If we think back to Diamonds Are Forever, there was another point that I did want to highlight that was mentioned there, and that was that there's this curious scene where Sean Connery as Bond is running through Willard White's private facility.
Seitdem ich eine Lesbe bin, verstehe ich, wie schwer es ist für eine Frau, das Gewicht zu halten. Ich darf jetzt überall aufs Damenklo ohne Ausrede. Auf Party. Früher hat es der Türsteher rausgeschmissen. Ja, jetzt darfst du einfach aufs Damenklo gehen und sagst, hier, I'm a lady. Aber seitdem ich lesbisch bin und weiblich, ist es schwer, das Gewicht zu halten. Ich verstehe das jetzt. Die Frage der Frau, sehe ich dick aus in der Hose? Die hätten den Gender-Unfug niemals erfinden dürfen, wenn die nicht gewollt hätten, dass ich das benutze. Das ist doch wie ein Angebot. Also, da kann man dann nicht einfach vorbeigehen. Aber jetzt verstehe ich auch Frauen besser. Wir machen einfach weiter.
Right? So there's NASA, but then there's Willard White's private space program facility that has a set where they're filming a moon landing and Bond runs in there, right, and then he hops into the moon buggy thing and he crashes through the wall. So what I get from this, my thesis, is that Fleming knew all about this and he's constantly inconsistent.
Das nochmal festzuhalten. Ich wäre froh, wenn Corona tödlich wäre. Aber es macht dick. Es ist wesentlich schlimmer. Corona macht dick. Und die sollen endlich den... juhu! Gut.
Constantly telling us what's going on with the very topic that we're all here to learn about. And he's telling us, perhaps in Weidner-style fashion, if you've seen Weidner on 2001: A Space Odyssey, that what you think is going on, that's a frontispiece. And the real thing is the shadow government, the military-industrial complex, the real space program that is all this hidden tech, right? And they do have a breakaway civilization planned. Another interesting point on it, Diamonds Are Forever, and this needs to be mentioned because it's going to tie in with Fleming. Diamonds features the kidnapping of Willard White, Howard Hughes, by Ernst Stavro Blofeld, echoing the gemstone file claim that Onassis had Hughes perhaps kidnapped and brought to his private Greek island of Skorpios. Hughes, the aerospace magnate, worked with the CIA in Project Azorian, which was to build this massive submarine that could basically swallow other underwater crafts, right? So this is completely, like, directly out of Spectre. It was directly out of a Bond novel, right? And this is what Howard Hughes is actually up to. Fleming was a close friend of Aristotle Onassis. Aristotle Onassis offered to put up the money for the first Bond film. Now, this didn't actually happen. It was later on. Other people put the money up for it. But Fleming and Onassis were BFF, right? Best friends forever. And so this is where we make these connections. And here's Aristotle working his mojo on Jackie, right? Now, another interesting thesis here, too, is that was this a mafia killing, right? Because in the mafia, supposedly you take the life of another mobster. 5 years later, he takes the wife? I don't know. An interesting thesis. So as we move into the 80s, we're going to look at the Star Wars Defense Initiative, right? Killer spies from outer space. Revealed publicly in 1983 by Reagan and reportedly conceived at Bohemian Grove, the answer to the Cold War and mutually assured destruction would be the weaponization of space through the Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative. This is from Moonraker. This is when they're flying around in space and shooting lasers at each other, right? It's a really ridiculous scene, but this is the actual, if you research the Star Wars program, these are the actual 1983 plans that were released to the public for how SDI would be conducted, right? Now, this is a major move by Reagan. I think it was going on prior to Reagan, but again, we always get stuff revealed publicly that's been going on for a long time. And you're going to start seeing that this is actually very similar to what we're going to see as Skynet. And I think it is Skynet, right? Another weird 1983 film, same year as the release of SDI, at least publicly. War Games, starring Matthew Broderick. ARPANET, DARPANET, Internet. The, quote, intergalactic computer network, as it was first conceived of by its founders, emerges from the same bowels of the SDI and the shadow government. Linked with the concept of the weaponization of space, the internet would function to form the eventual Internet of Things in Asimov fashion. And we're going to get to Asimov here in a minute. This is the rise of Skynet and AI. And here's Ferris Bueller hacking the Pentagon. You laugh, right? Okay. But also, don't ever hook your nukes up to your Atari, which is what he does, right? And because then the robot plays nuke games with itself. Back to Fleming really quick. Now you might say, Jay, Fleming died in 1964. Why are you claiming these later movies have anything to do with Fleming? Good question. Fleming stayed in contact up to his death with Cubby Broccoli and Saltzman, and those are the longtime producers of all the Bond novels. So while Fleming did not write the Moonraker, Diamonds, and Golden Gun screenplays, Broccoli and Saltzman were intimates of Fleming and produced, as I said, most of the films. Did Ian continue, or did he unload to them secret information that they would later? I think so, right? And this is what we're endeavoring to show. And I think it's a reasonable conjecture given the intense predictive programming that we've seen in the Bond stories so far. This, again, exemplifies my claim that Hollywood is BFF with the intelligence agencies and has been for a long time. So we're going to look at another 80s incarnation of this. A View to an EMP Earthquake Attack, or A View to a Kill. This is the 1985 Bond story that's actually based on a short story Fleming wrote. In this, Max Zorin, another genetically obsessed, genetically enhanced, privatized eugenicist through paperclip, plans to use an earthquake EMP weapon to attack the West Coast and wipe out Silicon Valley, obtaining a monopoly on the latest computer chips. The film even appears to show the internet as Max Zorin scans 007 to look up his online identity, right? So he's looking up his 1985 Facebook, right? The villain is, of course, Christopher Walken, right, as Max Zorin. Another interesting aspect to this is that at the end of the film, 007 receives the Order of Lenin. But he's supposed to be the Cold Warrior, right? Why is he receiving the Order of Lenin? I think it's controlled dialectics, right? And this is actually what Carol Quigley tells us in Tragedy and Hope, that much of the Cold War was actually a controlled dialectic. There's a sense in which Stalin actually did reject the money that was offered to him from the Atlanticists, from the Western powers. So there was a time period where there was opposition from Stalin, and this is what in part gives birth to the Cold War. But as Anthony Sutton has shown us, it was actually the Western banking elite that funded both the Bolsheviks and Wall Street. Now we're going to move to some fictional book incarnations of this notion of the breakaway civilization. The 1932 novel Brave New World by Aldous Huxley describes a coming dystopia where humans are GMO creations from test tubes. They're organized into a caste-based technocracy. This technocratic control grid is run by 10 world socialist controllers who suppress true metaphysics, as well as science and the arts. Bertrand Russell wrote explicitly of this intention in his book, Impact of Science on Society, where he said that we would actually have to stamp out the spirit in man and get rid of Shakespeare, get rid of the classics, because we can't have that amongst the population. It's got to be it's got to be Common Core, baby. That's what it's got to be. Now, another interesting feature of this novel that I don't think most people pick up on is that Huxley intentionally included his characters to have the names of both capitalists, monopolists, and communists. So you'll have characters like Bernard Marx. We have our Ford's Day instead of our Lord's Day, right? Why is this? Well, that's because monopolistic capitalism and communism are two roads that lead to the same final world socialist fascist state. They're just ideologies that are trafficked by the oligarchs. They don't really care about socialism, fascism, communism. They want control, but it doesn't matter it's a means to an end, doesn't matter. This novel also contains an explicit breakaway civilization for the elite. Mustafa Mond, who's the central antagonist in the novel, who plays the role of the world socialist controller of the UK. There's a curious scene where he's confronted by John the Savage, who's a guy who grew up. They have a reservation where you can still grow up according to the old way and not part of the world socialist technocratic system. John the Savage says, I know that you like Shakespeare, I know that you like the Bible, I know that you actually like true metaphysics. Why do you hide it? Mustafa Mond says in this climactic scene, it has to be this way because they don't care about these things. Why would I throw pearls before swine? And so, by the way, John, if you like, you can actually go to our breakaway island where we actually do talk about these things and we don't suppress science there. Would you know, right? Interesting, 1932, and he's writing about this, as well as cloning in 1932. 1951, Asimov's Foundation, Breakaway Civilization, and Google. The character Hari Seldon creates a mass tracking algorithm to predict future movements. His Encyclopedia Galactica it's kind of a distraction, right? But its true purpose is only known to those who make up the foundation, this sort of secret society of scientism, if you will. He knows that, in other words, that the galactic empire is going to collapse, and Seldon thinks that through psychohistory or this mass tracking algorithm, he can actually stave off the long-term collapse of the civilization before the rise of the Second Galactic Empire. So Seldon's breakaway civilization is based on scientism, which is interesting because if we think about the Bavarian Illuminati, there's this mythology that they were like into Satanism and the occult. That's actually not true at all. They were much in the sense of Voltaire or Diderot, they were rationalists, right? And that's sort of what's going on here with Hari Seldon, where if we were to bring it into modern parlance, where I see this being predictive programming, is that this mass tracking algorithm is actually Google. I mean, that's pretty much what Google or Palantir, right, which are actually openly CIA-funded corporations, companies. It's involved with mass data collection, right? That's what the NSA is for, right? All these things are just arms of the NSA. Atlas Shrugged. 1957, Ayn Rand publishes a breakaway civilization bestseller, Atlas Shrugged. Who is John Galt? Galt's, or Atlantis, is a breakaway civilization established in Colorado and exists behind a hologram. The tech elite have created a Tesla-style free energy engine, which is what powers Galt's Gulch. Meanwhile, quote, civilization is allowed to collapse, awaiting its coming reformation. The similar theme is also found in Rand's novel Anthem, and I don't know if you know this, Ayn Rand was BFF with Alan Greenspan. Interesting side note. 2010 bestseller, and again, I had to kind of pick and choose, right? So I mean, there's so many examples. I had to pick and choose certain things. I thought this was an interesting sci-fi novel, thriller by Justin Cronin. Features a bio-outbreak that leads to a shadow government establishing a breakaway civilization where genetically superior children are immune to the bio-outbreak, zombie stuff, blah, blah, blah. After a millennia passes, a new civilization continues on with a Novus Ordo Seclorum. Back to 1983. DARPA's Strategic Computing AI Skynet. 1983 was when I was war games, right? Well, it's not just Strategic Defense Initiative.
Es ist so krass. Na, die haben das Skynet schon gebaut, da war ich noch nicht mal geboren. Da habe ich okay Verständnis, wenn dann Leute irgendwas schreiben. Deswegen sind die jetzt raus. Na, weil die Infos sind viel zu geil, als dass man hier reinquatschen kann. Weiter geht's.
There's also the Strategic Computing Initiative. This is the same year as SDI, begins the work of erecting a fully functional AI system with autonomous land, sea, air vehicles capable of complex reconnaissance and attack missions, Dr. Robert Kahn. This is the actual document, declassified, it's open source. SDI is thus intimately interested in AI as occupying a central role in its execution of aerial and stellar programs in the weaponization of space. Skynet goes online. August 1996, the Air Force puts out a document, Information Operations, a New War Fighting Capability white paper. This also deals with Skynet, right? The document includes the implementation of microchip soldiers that will actually link to Skynet. Here is a graphic from that document, and you'll see that you have the satellite network, the ground-based communication systems linked to directed energy weapons, right? So we're right back at man with the golden gun. Yeah? Now, granted, yes, I understand this is a warfare application, right? But like so many things like iPhones or the internet, what begins in military warfare and cryptography later, 10, 20, 30 years, is what's given to the public, right? So this is not just a military application of Skynet. This is what's coming for the public. We move to the modern film revelations. 2001: A Space Odyssey. Kubrick's 1968 masterpiece details mankind's journey of evolutionary ascent to apotheosis through technology. The key to this journey is HAL 9000, generally seen as the final enemy of man. However, it's actually HAL's deactivation by Bowman that leads to Bowman's discovery of the secret space program, which tells him to follow the monolith, right? And I didn't realize this until I went back and watched it pretty recently. I thought, man, you know, I always thought of it as Bowman pulling the floppy disks out of HAL, right? And he then that's like the final confrontation of man versus AI. And then I thought, well, actually, I realized that's what triggers the mission, right? That's what triggers that screen to come on that tells Bowman, follow the monolith. That's what you're supposed to do. Clark's novel version reveals.
Ihr könnt euch an den Monolithen erinnern? Bevor der Monolith kam, hat er dem Supercomputer die Disketten rausgezogen. Der Name des Supercomputers und dieser künstlichen Intelligenz war ja Corona. Ja, Skynet hieß ja Corona. Cool, dann wäre das auch geklärt. Wenn ihr es jetzt nicht versteht, ist nicht schlimm. Wir müssten ja alles verstehen.
A breakaway star child civilization. In Arthur C. Clarke's novel version and its sequel, 2010, Starchild sets off a nuke in the atmosphere, leading to a new world. It's a pattern we've seen. By his 3001 novel, man has become a god able to traverse the galaxy through the rapid advance of transhumanism. Hal is shown to be the good guy. So it confirms that my reading, I think, of 2001. By the fact that in Clarke's 3001, Hal and Bowman have become a single entity. Halman. Pictured, Clarke, Kubrick, and NASA's Dr. George Mueller, right? By the way, in Diamonds Are Forever, there's a really funny scene where Roger Moore goes up to a keypad and he types in That's very weird. This is Spielberg's first alien venture in 1977. It features a secret space program of scientific elite, Lacombe, who's actually a stand-in for Jacques Vallée, right? The character played by the French actor whose name escapes me at the moment, but there you go. This is actually an attempt to base and learn this new technology, this new form of communication, right, through music, through sound, all the advanced alien prowess. And to cover this up, what does the government do? Well, they fake news stories. They stage a biowarfare release that misleads the public. They lay out dead, cows and stuff. The aliens appear to be able to organize synchronicitous events that lead Roy to Devil's Tower. Right? If you remember Dreyfus going crazy and his wife thinks he's playing with his mashed potatoes and filming that, right? Or he's forming a Devil's Mountain. So if you recall, I began the lecture talking about Twilight language or these synchronicities, right? It's roughly the same idea here. And that's who's organizing this, right? Terminator, James Cameron. Skynet is revealed openly. Cameron has worked extensively with NASA, with the US government, on the BP oil spill, while he was also slated to film the Mars mission of late, although he supposedly backed out of that. Cameron's films are some of the highest grossing of all time, Avatar, right, Titanic. In Terminator 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 20. Skynet and the AI control grid are being installed presently as coming smart cities. That's what we saw in the last two installations of this series. There is a fascinating lecture that I think you should all look up if you think I'm stretching it here, and it's the CEO of IBM. She's given this lecture many times. Her name's Jenny Romedy. She's in Singapore, or she goes to Singapore, Rio, different places like that, and she talks about what's going to happen in the smart city. And she says, you are going to have Minority Report style pre-crime. And you're going to feel so safe, right? Because we're going to know everything about you. We're going to know all your medical records and all your history. And we're going to know the crimes that you commit before you commit them. It's going to be great. Yeah. Skynet, of course, seeks to wipe out the human population as only transhuman super soldiers survive later in the series, right? I think this is a dumb movie, but I had to throw it in here because it's related to this. Contact, 1997, right? What's up with Matthew McConaughey, right, in these space movies? I don't know. Based on Carl Sagan's 1985 book of the same name, the search for intelligent life in the universe through SETI leads Jodie Foster's character Ellie down a rabbit hole of privately funded space program that utilizes exotic technology and suppressed metaphysics to tap into other dimensions. Sagan gave famous talks illustrating the geometry of higher dimensions, or the tesseract, or the hypercube. This is going to come into Interstellar. The film bears a striking resemblance to Interstellar. We must also, however, mention Gattaca, a GMO eugenics-based breakaway civilization. Ethan Hawke's character Vincent longs to leave the Earth through Gattaca Aerospace, a private aerospace space program. Yet his flawed genetics do not allow him to qualify, eugenics. In this dystopia, humans are tracked and traced by their DNA at all times, smart cities. Vincent and Jerome hatch a scheme to utilize Jerome's DNA to give Vincent cover. Once again, a private aerospace company run by a genetic so-called elite determines who will go into the future and into space, I guess. Forgotten film, a film that most people don't really like. I liked it, I think it's good. Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow, Gwyneth Paltrow, Jude Law. It's a fantasy film that depicts a Totenkopf, a death's head order that seeks to utilize a massive war machine and artificial intelligence to depopulate the globe and reseed the planet with explicitly Noah's Ark. It's a shuttle that is the final goal of a privately run secret space program. Paperclip on acid. Another film people don't like, I think it's great, The Box, 2009 Richard Kelly film. Richard Kelly made Donnie Darko, if you remember that. Tagline to this film is, "You are the experiment." Kelly's The Box functions as a tribute to both 2001 and Kubrick, where a secret space program that uses NASA as a front is also planning on wiping out the globe through a mass occult brainwashing technique. There's even references to 9/11 in this film, which I think is interesting. Now, this is post 9/11, but it's referred to as a kind of ritual operation, which I find fascinating and very plausible. We eventually discover that Arlington Stewart, played by Frank Langella, is the head of the secret space program, and he's possessed by an interdimensional entity. Here's the craziest part of that movie. This is actually a scene in the film. Kelly's film not only shows the manipulation of the masses through consumerism and greed, the entities achieve their ends by ritual magic involving quasi-Masonic ceremonies and ritual baptism. Strikingly, Stewart's SSP contains a map with magic squares that flip over to reveal the Pentagon's CENTCOM, NORTHCOM, EUSCOM. Thus the cryptocracy. Also.
So, jetzt wo ich gespeist habe, werde ich jetzt mal gucken, was die anderen so treiben. Und was wir heute Abend noch machen. War aber sehr informativ. Es ist immer wieder cool, sich die alten Dinge nochmal anzuhören. Also für euch ist es meistens zum ersten Mal. Für mich ist es meistens, ich finde es spannend, Dinge, die man schon kennt, nochmal anzuhören mit dem Wissen von jetzt. Das kann man bei Simpsons-Serien, ist das so geil. Ich habe Simpsons mit 18 anders gesehen als mit 23 oder als mit 28 oder jetzt. Weil du halt ein bestimmtes anderes Level erreicht hast. Egal. Ich gucke erstmal, was die anderen machen und dann kommen wir nochmal machen was Sinnvolles. Also sinnvoll.